Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This program today talk today is sponsored by the Harvard Government Department Political Theory Colloquium, which usually meets on Thursdays, but this is a special Friday afternoon meeting. And it's co-sponsored by the Program on Constitutional Government, also part of the Harvard Department of Government. And our speaker today is Devin Stauffer. Devin Stauffer, who got his PhD in Boston College. Where did you go to college?
Kenyon College.
Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. That's where he went. And he's now Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of Plato's Introduction to the Question of Justice, came out in 2001. Co-author and co-translator of Empire and the Ends of Politics, Plato's Menexenus and Pericles' Funeral Oration. And his second book is the Unity of Plato's Gorgias, Rhetoric, Justice, and the Philosophic Life. He's also published articles on classical and modern topics in journals, such as the Review of Politics, the American Political Science Review, note that, everybody, and the Journal of Politics, and here he is with a smiling face, Devin Stauffer. He will talk, and then we can ask him questions. Devin.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. And thank you all for coming. A lot of familiar faces, but not all familiar. I want to start by emphasizing how limited the aims of my paper are, and how even more limited the aims of my talk today are going to be. That Socrates and Aristophanes, as all of you who have read it know, is a bewildering book. It's probably Leo Strauss's most baffling book, and it's surely one reason why it's one of his least famous and least studied works, even though Strauss had a very high opinion of it himself. Harvey told me at breakfast this morning that Leo Strauss told him that it was his favorite of his books. And I think the reason may be that he took a perverse delight in leading his readers on wild goose chases. I imagine him laughing to himself as he envisioned how confused we would all be. So I don't claim, not even close to have understood all of the almost infinite twists and turns of Strauss's discussion, or even have succeeded in finding my way to his core argument. All I've tried to do is to find a certain path through the work that can illuminate what I think are some of at least the key puzzles and questions, including the puzzle or question of why Strauss devoted such meticulous and intense attention to Aristophanes in the first place. Now, just to state without really explaining or defending what I think is at least a decent, workable, preliminary answer to that question. Strauss seems to have thought that Aristophanes, precisely because he was so close to Socrates, both in the sense of knowing him very well and in the deeper sense of sharing quite a bit of common ground with him, could serve two purposes. First, he could bring out certain aspects of Socrates and Socratic philosophy that Socrates' students and defenders, so especially Plato and Xenophon, kept more hidden in their portraits of him. And in that respect, the fact that Aristophanes posed as a critic of Socrates, even if that was only a somewhat serious pose, had a certain advantage in allowing him to be more truthful and more explicit about some things. And second, since Aristophanes' critique of Socrates is at least somewhat serious, and since he does present an alternative to Socratic philosophy in the Socratic life, he can help one to see Socrates and the worth of what he stood for as a problem, that is, as something whose goodness shouldn't be taken for granted. And in this last respect, Strauss indicates in his introduction that Aristophanes' presentation of the so-called problem of Socrates is at least in some ways more worthy of attention than the critique delivered by the man who coined that term, Nietzsche. And Strauss leads one to wonder, at any rate, whether it's not in the laughing Aristophanes rather than the lamenting Nietzsche that one can find the deepest critique of Socrates and Socratic philosophy. Now, if Aristophanes is a critic of Socrates, he was a critic of an unusual sort, a quite friendly sort, and one who had considerable sympathy and admiration for the target of his critique. And Strauss makes this clear, or at least as clear as he makes anything in Socrates and Aristophanes. He makes this clear in his interpretation of the clouds. And it's true, of course, that the well-known aspects of the clouds that are Aristophanes' critique of Socrates are certainly present in Strauss's account, as they would have to be in any adequate interpretation of the clouds. So just to sum up this line of thought first. Aristophanes' Socrates is recklessly imprudent. His all-consuming dedication to the study of nature leaves him without a care or a clue about the ephemerals with whom he must share the earth, if not his think tank. He's wildly incautious in proclaiming his atheistic teaching to all comers. He teaches young and old, stupid and smart, father and son, that Zeus does not exist. And his radical arguments run roughshod over the sacred limits and bonds of the family. And for all of his hyper-rational recklessness, he ends up paying the fitting price when the concerns on which he tramples strike back at him at the end of the play, and his beloved think tank is put to the torch. So all this, I think, is the familiar side of the clouds, and it's pretty familiar to everyone who's read the clouds. And Aristophanes' critique of Socrates, broadly speaking, on the plane of political prudence is, I think, straightforward and clear enough. But Strauss's analysis of the clouds doesn't end with his presentation of that critique, even if that critique is an important part of his analysis. Because he's at pains to lay out, as much as he's at pains to lay out Aristophanes' critique of Socrates for his imprudence, Strauss also indicates that that critique conceals a tribute to Socrates' power and his charm. And it's true that the power and charm of Socrates are hard to see in the clouds, but they're pointed to especially by Aristophanes' indication of their effect on Phidippides. So that's the young, talented young man who becomes Socrates' pupil in the clouds when his father proves to be too dim-witted and too prone to distraction by flea bites and other things to absorb Socrates' instruction. And so, but Phidippides' conversion by Socrates is the great success story of the clouds. Unfortunately, and this is, I think, a difficulty, not just for understanding the clouds, but for understanding Aristophanes' view of Socrates simply, because Phidippides receives the most important parts of his Socratic education, those parts that make the deepest impact of him on him off stage, back in the think tank. What Strauss calls Phidippides' indoor instruction is hidden from our view. And this is a frustrating thing. But we can get some inkling of its effect, of it by observing its effect on Phidippides once he emerges from the think tank. And Socrates' effect on Phidippides is so profound that Strauss says that it must be regarded as a very great victory. And he says that once it's noticed, one must wonder whether the victory or the defeat is greater. After all, that a weak and foolish old man turns against Socrates while his much sharper son refuses to help burn down the think tank hardly reflects a complete failure on Socrates' part. On the other hand, not only does Socrates' success with Phidippides not protect him from the suffering caused by his imprudence, but more important, Socrates' conversion of Phidippides is not complete. Phidippides, as Strauss puts it, has become captivated by the possibilities that Socrates opened up for him, but he hasn't been converted by Socrates to Socrates. He has not learned to replace his end by the Socratic end. In particular, he hasn't been converted by Socrates to the Socratic ways of extreme continence and endurance. Those are Strauss's words. And the limits of Phidippides' Socratic conversion are especially important in light of an arresting question that Strauss puts at the end of his discussion of the clouds. Is Phidippides, Strauss asks, a comic equivalent of Aristophanes, who perhaps also charmed or instructed by Socrates himself, also accepts only a part of the Socratic teaching? That question comes near the very end of his discussion of the clouds. But Strauss has sort of prepared the way for it by pointing in earlier passages to Aristophanes' closeness to Socrates, while also indicating that some distance remained between the two men, especially regarding what Strauss calls extreme continence. But after finally posing the question in such a direct and arresting way, Strauss goes a step further with another striking formulation. He says, the answer to our question depends decisively on whether Aristophanes can be presumed to have agreed with Socrates regarding the gods. Now, by pointing to the question of Aristophanes' view of the gods, in the way that he does and where he does, in the context that he does, Strauss directs us to consider, I think, two possibilities. The first is that Aristophanes, like his Phidippides, agreed with Socrates regarding the gods without embracing his way of life. So this would seem to be one possibility. That is, in other words, that perhaps Aristophanes accepted the Socratic assertion that Zeus does not even exist, which is the formulation that Strauss uses repeatedly, but did not think that one had to live like Socrates to come to that view, nor that holding that view would necessarily lead one to live like Socrates. So that's one possibility. The other is that Aristophanes did not agree with Socrates, at least not entirely, regarding the gods, and that his embrace of a different end or way of life is somehow connected with that at least partial disagreement. But the difficulty is Strauss suggests that the question of whether Aristophanes agreed with Socrates regarding the gods can't be settled on the basis of the clouds alone. And so that's the ultimate question, I think, if not, it was certainly not the most obvious one, that he pursues in his examination of the other comedies. So I think I take that to be the question that runs through the book, even if Strauss never provides a straightforward answer to that question. And I think that question can help one find a kind of pathway through what otherwise seems this bizarre romp of crazy consideration upon crazy consideration. So to turn to the other comedies. Now, just as Strauss's interpretation of the clouds moves from Aristophanes' readily accessible critique of Socrates to a deeper question about his relationship to Socrates, so too Strauss's discussion of the other plays moves on more than one level. And the first level, which I'm not going to say that much about, is simply an extension by way of inversion of Aristophanes' critique of Socrates for his imprudence. So, unlike Socrates, Aristophanes respects what Strauss calls the fundamental requirements of the city. That's another one of these sort of catchphrases that runs throughout the book, and there seem to be three fundamental requirements: the affirmation of divine rule, the prohibition against father beating, and the prohibition against incest. That's what the city needs, those three things. Unlike Socrates, but more than merely respecting these requirements, though, by not treading on them as Socrates does, Aristophanes comes to light as a teacher of the just things, who rebukes the city for its worst tendencies, especially its thirst for war and for punishment, and mocks dangerous boasters who threaten the established order. So by making radical innovations and radical innovators appear either impossible or ridiculous or both, Aristophanes' comedies send the edifying message that the traditional ways are not so bad after all. And by defending the city in that way, even as they work to soften its most brutal tendencies, his comedies are what Strauss calls the true just speech, spinning on the just speech from the clouds. All right, fine. I think that's clear enough, but one can go too far with that line of thought. Not all radical innovators in Aristophanes are brought to ruin as Socrates is. And Aristophanes can hardly be regarded as simply an edifying conservative convinced of the soundness of the old ways, even if that is a certain strand of his plays. And his defense and education of the city, moreover, have at least as much to do with his desire to defend himself and to secure a place for poetry as they do with any concern for the betterment of the city. So Aristophanes' comedies, according to Strauss, persuade the audience not to take him too seriously, to see him as a laughable, unthreatening force in the city, even as he's able to critique or transform the city by means of the very same conceits that make him appear so harmless. So comic poetry, unlike Socratic philosophy, and this is a theme I think Strauss develops in many places and at great length, provides both a shield and a sword in its never-ending battle against its would-be persecutors. But the more Strauss calls our attention to Aristophanes' concern with self-protection, the more likely we are to come to doubt that the key difference between Aristophanes and Socrates is that Aristophanes is more devoted to the city. And while Strauss does allow that impression to arise, or that balloon to fill, he pretty quickly punctures it by suggesting first that the self-seeking Diciopolis of the Acarnians is a stand-in for Aristophanes, and then by suggesting that Gorgias, the impious hero of the peace, the guy who ascends to heaven on the back of a dung beetle and ultimately ends up taking on Zeus himself, he's also a stand-in for Aristophanes. So if the two heroes, these two heroes at any rate, Diciopolis and Gorgias, are taken together, it's hard to see where the comic poet, as represented by each and thus by the compilation of the two, differs very much from Socrates. Strauss puts it this way: while Socrates denies the existence of the gods and turns his back on the city, the comic poet in the Acarnians turns his back on the city but doesn't act against the gods. And the comic poet in the piece acts in harmony with the city but not against the gods. But that Aristophanes divides his actions into two separate plays, it may indicate his awareness that it's unwise to display one's injustice and one's impiety at the same time. But while that may be a sign of the superior prudence of the comic poet, it's hardly a powerful expression of his greater devotion to the city. So I think we're led to the question, is there no difference then between Aristophanes and Socrates, beyond Aristophanes' obviously superior prudence and his discovery in comic poetry of a set of rhetorical weapons that give strength to that prudence? So that's the question. Is there a deeper difference than the rhetorical prudential difference? And I think Strauss's answer to that question is no, that's not the only difference. For one thing, if Diciopolis is a stand-in for Aristophanes, that would seem to extend to the question of what Strauss calls his end, the character of which is indicated by his delight in delicious food, and especially his enjoyment of wine and sex. And especially when describing Diciopolis' desire for the latter two attractions, Strauss makes a point of reminding us that Diciopolis is Aristophanes in disguise. So, but what's that mean? Does it mean that we should think that Aristophanes himself relished the pleasures of drink and sex? Yeah, it probably does mean that. But it also means that the pleasure that Aristophanes undoubtedly took in composing his comedies is, as Strauss puts it, akin in different ways to the enjoyment deriving from food and sex, rather than the less social enjoyment deriving from food, however delicious. Comedy whose mother is laughter gives birth to laughter. The comic poet's enjoyment is essentially social, although it is not simply political. Those are Strauss's words, not mine. I can't come up with stuff like that. In thinking about, but in thinking about Aristophanes' enjoyment of a pleasure akin to the pleasures deriving from wine and sex, not to mention his enjoyment of those pleasures themselves, we're reminded of Pheidippides and the limits of his conversion by Socrates. And so I think we're brought back to the suggestion from the clouds, namely that Aristophanes differed from Socrates not only in his superior prudence, but also in his end, in his rejection of Socrates' extreme continence. And I would say, those two things, his end and his rejection of Socrates' extreme continence, because the extreme continence is not itself the end. In fact, those last 2 points are related. I would put the relationship this way. Whereas Socrates tethered his heart for the sake of knowledge of things aloft, Aristophanes would seem to have gone easier on his own heart, since he was more open to and embracing of earthier pleasures and experiences. But what does that have to do, if that's right, what does that have to do with the question of the gods? Insofar as Aristophanes is tragaios too, and not just dikaiopoulos, does that suggest that he shared Socrates' impiety while not fully embracing his end? Or does Aristophanes' difference regarding the end reflects somehow a disagreement regarding the gods? This is, in a way, brings us back to new versions of the same questions that I think Strauss led us to at the end of his treatment of the clouds. And I would say nothing I've said so far, I think, provides a basis for settling those questions. So it's necessary to keep digging and to try to uncover Aristophanes' own teaching about the gods. The Socratic teaching, at least in Aristophanes' presentation of it, is clear. Zeus does not even exist. But what is the Aristophanian teaching? It proves, I think, much harder to say. This much, I think, can be said with confidence, and I'm more sure of what I'm about to say than what I'm going to say a bit later. This much, I think, can be said with confidence. That Aristophanes carefully examines, as he may have thought Socrates didn't adequately do, the human roots and the complex character of piety. Of course, what it means for Aristophanes to carefully examine something can involve some crazy conceits. But through some wild conceits, especially in the peace, the birds, and the Plutos, Aristophanes conveys the suggestion that piety is rooted in human neediness and in the inability of human beings to secure all of the good things they desire through human efforts alone. So neediness and weakness. But if human beings initially turn to the gods for the help that they desire and need, it would seem he doesn't leave it there, that it would seem that a more serious and interesting, but also more problematic and darker relationship arises between the gods and at least some human beings. Because the gods, Aristophanes' gods, are not willing to just serve as the mere providers that men need, or maybe a better way of putting that point is to say that human piety is not so simple as it first appears. The gods in Aristophanes' presentation are important not only for the goods they promise to provide, but also for the support that they give as rulers to the fundamental requirements of the city. But the gods, as rulers and superior beings, also threaten human beings with evils, even as they entice them with goods. And in this connection, Strauss leads us to wonder about the meaning of Nicias's proof in the Knights that the gods must exist because they hate him, and about the fact that Philocleon's obsession with condemning and the wasps is rooted in his fear of the god's wrath if he's too compassionate and fails to carry out his duty. So these examples, I think, are important because they point to a more complex and interesting side of piety, rather than just wanting stuff that we can't provide for ourselves, but one which it appears Aristophanes has little sympathy, because this side of piety, rooted in, it seems, despair and a kind of fear-bred moralism, exacerbates those very same forces in the human soul and contributes to the belief in gods who introduce new terrors into human life and, as Strauss puts it, impair man's self-esteem. So in that sense, he thinks that kind of piety gives rise to gods who then are very problematic for human life. And given the threat that Aristophanes thought piety could pose for human happiness, it's not surprising that he reflected on its mutability and tractability. And the mutability of piety, if not, I think his view is that it's mutable but not completely tractable, that its mutability, if not its tractability, is suggested by Aristophanes' presentation of a number of radical and successful theological revolutions, not only in the peace, but also in the Plutos and the birds. In the birds, which is probably the most well-known of these, Aristophanes goes so far as to present a human being who becomes the highest of the gods by using the birds as his allies. The human being in question is Pesthyros, the visionary who launches a crusade against the Olympian gods out of a desire to free the city from the condemning spirit that dominates life in Athens and that's tied to the Athenians' fear of gods like Zeus. So unlike Socrates, Pesthyros doesn't deny the existence of Zeus. Rather, he acts on the premise that Zeus's power is not all that it's cracked up to be, and that it will break when it's tested. And it does break when Pesthyros introduces new gods, the birds, who promise to provide men with a more reliable supply of health, prosperity, and long life. Zeus's power is broken. But as attractive to human beings as the rule of the birds proves to be, the birds themselves turn out in the end to be mere foot soldiers in Pesthyros' own revolution. He's the one who triumphs. His triumph is shocking. And not only because he ends up roasting and eating some of his allies who are supposed to be his new gods. Strauss said a crime worse than cannibalism. But what does Aristophanes think of this triumph? Does he endorse Pesthyros' revolution? And there I think there's not a simple answer to that question. On the one hand, Strauss indicates that Aristophanes would have been sympathetic with the original motives behind Pesthyros' revolution. On the other hand, Pesthyros' vast ambition radically to transform the government of heaven and earth goes far beyond Aristophanes' own more moderate ambitions. Back on the other hand, it wasn't Aristophanes, after all, who decided to present, without evident condemnation, the shocking triumph of Pesthyros, who is, after all, his brainchild. Yet back on the other hand, as shocking as Pesthyros' triumph is, it's not that shocking, since not only is Pesthyros' action manifestly impossible, he can't actually overthrow Zeus with an army of birds, but even in the fantastical vision of his triumph, the city still looks up to the gods, and father beating remains forbidden. As Strauss puts it, radically differing from Socrates, Pesthyros acts in accordance with the fundamental requirements of the city. So his Pesthyros' triumph proves to be as much a lesson in the limits of even the most extreme theological political transformations as it is a celebration of one especially fantastical such transformation. And by indicating those limits, Aristophanes respects and teaches the impossibility of successfully denying the fundamental requirements of the city, even if he also suggests at the same time that those requirements, including the city's need to bow to divine rule, are necessary evils. All right, now, I think nothing that I've said so far about Aristophanes' treatment of piety and the gods requires that Aristophanes was himself pious. And at least some of the things I've said, I would say, move at least some way in the opposite direction. So should one draw the conclusion then that Aristophanes was every bit as atheistic as Socrates, and that he differed from Socrates only in having, as he saw it, a deeper grasp of the character and grip of piety, and thus also of the need to treat the question of the gods with greater rhetorical delicacy than Socrates treated it? That's one possibility, and there's passages in Strauss's text that would support that conclusion. The most direct one is a famous passage in his discussion of the peace, insofar as anything's famous in this unknown book, but it would be this. There Strauss develops the suggestion that in Aristophanes' comedies, natural explanations of phenomena, thunder, lightning, war, whatever, appear to be the comic equivalents of theological explanations, and vice versa. And after remarking that from the point of view of the Aristophanian Socrates, comic equivalents par excellence, or in the strictest sense, occur only in the region in which theologia and physiologia diverge. That's Strauss again. I don't say physiologia and theologia. Strauss returns to the theme of boasting. And this leads to a very striking statement about Zeus. And I'll quote this at some length. He says, "Now if Zeus, who claims or on whose behalf men claim that he is the father of gods and men, that he is most powerful and wise, and that he deserves the highest veneration, if he does not even exist, as Aristophanes' Socrates indeed asserts, he is the greatest example of boasting that can be imagined. His case is the most perfect case of contrast between claim and being. He is the absolute subject of comedy. The comedy par excellence is the comedy of the gods." That's Strauss's statement. So does this statement settle the matter of Aristophanes' answer to the crucial question about the gods? Perhaps, and I'm open to the possibility that it does, but I don't think it does, and there's several considerations that should give one pause. The first is that even in the statement just quoted, which seems at first glance to be the most direct and emphatic affirmation of Aristophanes' atheism in the book, Strauss gives us reason to hesitate. The claim that Zeus does not even exist is explicitly ascribed, even here, only to Aristophanes' Socrates, and it's referred to repeatedly as an assertion. In addition, Strauss twice goes out of his way in this context to remind us that while Socrates would always give a natural explanation of, in this case, the issue at hand is the Peloponnesian War, that Socrates, and he says Aristophanes, he pointedly remarks, is not Socrates. Now, I think it would be going too far to take those and other such remarks to mean that whereas Socrates replaces theological explanations with natural explanations, Aristophanes would just simply do the reverse. I don't think that's what Strauss means. But they do introduce some doubt as to whether Aristophanes shared Socrates' confidence in the soundness of the natural explanations offered by natural science, and whether he would dismiss Zeus as a risible boaster as readily as his Socrates does. All right. But now we get into the part that I'm least sure of, but it is in a way most important. Because in trying to find one's way on this question, there's two other passages that especially call for consideration. One is Strauss's discussion of what he calls the theocosmogony of the birds. And the other is the whipping contest of the frogs. In my paper, I discuss both of these two passages at some length. For the sake of time, I'll right now just discuss what I think is the more important and baffling of them, the mystifying theocosmogony of the birds. So without getting into the complicated details of the whipping contest of the frogs, let me just say what I think the key lesson of that passage, concerns the limits of human knowledge, especially when it comes to knowing whether a purported God is truly a God. The god who's whipped in that contest is Dionysus. And while the whipping contest renders his divinity wholly questionable, as Strauss puts it, insofar as he proves to be vulnerable to pain and so forth, and repeatedly displays his imprudence, the contest doesn't disprove his divinity, and Strauss stresses that it's inconclusive. So the whipping contest is a lesson, at least I take it to be a lesson, of the limits of human knowledge of the gods. And so too, in its own way, is the so-called theocosmogony of the birds. And there too, I think we find a lesson, or at least a reflection of sorts, on the limits of human knowledge. Now, the theocosmogony of the birds, as the name implies, I guess if you can think about the name for a moment, theocosmogony, an account of the origins of the gods and the cosmos, given by the birds themselves. And in presenting that account, Strauss compares it with Socrates' account and stresses its differences with Socrates' account. The birds' account, the account of the origins, has several crucial features, I think. First, the origins in their account are dark, both literally or somewhat literally, since night is the first moving principle, and figuratively. That's the first one. Second point, Eros plays a crucial role. Although it's left unclear in the bird's account whether Eros is to be understood as a god or not. So the unanswered question of Eros' divinity, given the key role that is ascribed to Eros, shrouds the bird's entire account of the origin of the world and of the gods in mystery. But this darkness regarding Eros, it's Strauss's phrase, shouldn't be taken as a denigration of Eros. Far from it. If the Socratic principle is air, the birds, as Strauss puts it, replace air or ether by Eros. So this is a formulation of the difference, whatever that theoretical difference means. But the theoretical difference between Socrates and the birds also has a practical consequence or correlate. And Strauss is very concerned to consider the connection here between the theoretical and the practical. The birds, but in considering that, it has to be considered that the bird's doctrine, as much as Socrates' does, leads to a critique of law in favor of a life that is according to nature. So the practical opposition, whatever it is not a moral or political opposition, it would seem. Still, it seems that there is a practical opposition. As Strauss puts it, the bird's doctrine of the origins leads to the recommendation set forth by the unjust speech in the clouds, which means living a lusty life. Just as the rejected Socratic doctrine leads to the demands for extreme continence and endurance. That's a difficult thing to understand. I try to understand it in the following way, starting from the Socratic side of the matter. To hold that the first principle, the principle par excellence, as Strauss puts it, is air or ether, is to hold that nature in its most important aspects may be intelligible, but that there's nothing truly shining, beautiful, or responsive about it. And it would seem to follow from such a view that all we can reasonably ask of nature is to know it, especially, to know it insofar as it's knowable, and that extreme continence and endurance are warranted and necessary to keep one's vision clear and to see and accept nature as it really is. Thus, as Strauss puts it, Socrates is led to debunking the things aloft. He does not leave any room for any things by nature beautiful or noble. That's Socrates. It's not the birds, about whom Strauss makes this arresting but difficult statement. The birds, however, by asserting the primacy of Eros, assign an unassailable place to the naturally festive and golden. In speaking here of the unassailable place that the birds assign to the naturally festive and golden, Strauss would seem to be pointing to the bird's own view of nature and its practical implications. So if confronted by the debunking Socrates, the birds would argue, if birds could argue, that Socrates fails to appreciate a joyous dimension of nature that inspires those who embrace it not just to think but to sing. But what about Aristophanes himself? Are we to think that the bird's doctrine expresses his own view? I don't know, but Strauss seems to suggest so. But he does so with an enigmatic line immediately after his remark about the unassailable place that the birds assign to the naturally festive and golden. Right on the heels of that line, he says this: as a consequence of this, that is the place the birds assign to the naturally festive and golden, as a consequence of this, Aristophanes is more tolerant of Zeus and the other gods than is his Socrates. But what does that odd line, which reads like a non sequitur, mean? Does it mean that Aristophanes' appreciation of the power and beauty of Eros somehow makes him more sympathetic to the gods who are, among other things, beautiful expressions of human yearnings and passions? Maybe, it may mean that, but I think it also means something more than that. Strauss also intends, I think, to indicate that because Aristophanes himself embraced the naturally festive and golden, and didn't impose on himself the demands of extreme continence and devotion to knowledge, it was not as crucial to him as it was to Socrates to demonstrate the non-existence of Zeus and the other gods. For Socrates, you could say everything leads to and depends on the truth of his fundamental assertion that Zeus does not even exist. If that assertion is false, his life is an enormous mistake. And even if it can't be known to be true, he's a tremendous boaster who gives up an awful lot for an unattainable end. But Aristophanes, for his part, may have thought that the origins are too dark for any human being to be sure of the truth of the Socratic assertion. And further, that state of affairs is not such a tragedy, since there is a life more worth living than the Socratic life. A less restrained life, more open to an array of naturally attractive experiences, he may have thought, is in greater harmony with the full range of our erotic human nature. Now, that's not to say that Aristophanes simply accepted as true the bird's doctrine of the origins. After all, the bird's doctrine is so unclear, so dark, that it's not even clear what it would mean to accept it as true. But Aristophanes' view may have been that the very darkness of the origins is further reasons to take one's bearings by the naturally festive and golden, and not by the deeply hidden or obscure. Now, if those last suggestions are on the right track, and that's admittedly a big if, I mean, this is the part of my interpretation that I'm least sure of, but if those are on the right track, then we have at least the beginnings of an answer to the earlier question about the possible connection between Aristophanes' thought regarding the gods and his difference from Socrates regarding their ends. Because if Aristophanes thought that Socrates' way of life rested on an excessive confidence in his fundamental assertion about the gods and a narrow, unerotic view of nature, we can begin to grasp why Aristophanes was willing to travel only so far with Socrates and why he was unwilling to abandon the pleasures of Dionysus, Aphrodite, and the Muses. Furthermore, Aristophanes may well have regarded his own embrace of a less continent life not only as a more robust response to our human condition and its joys and its limits, but also as an essential aid in coming to a more complete appreciation and understanding of human life as a whole. But last question, how would Socrates respond to Aristophanes? That's a question I think one can't help wondering about through almost every page of Strauss's book. But it's a question that Strauss himself raises directly only on the last page. And he's not very forthcoming in laying out an answer. He warns that the question is difficult. We cannot simply turn to Plato and Xenophon for the answer, since their Socrates, as he puts it, may owe his being to poetry as much as does the Aristophanian Socrates. And while it is, of course, true that the Socrates we see in Plato and Xenophon is hardly the same man that we see in Aristophanes, it's almost equally difficult, Strauss says, to say whether the profound differences between the Aristophanian Socrates and the Platonic Xenophontic Socrates must not be traced to a profound change in Socrates himself. So Strauss points here to the Socratic turn, it seems. But he says little about what was involved in that turn or about whether Aristophanes grasped its full significance. Those are not questions, as it seems to me, that Strauss even tries to settle in Socrates and Aristophanes. Still, he does provide some direction by emphasizing the intense concern the Platonic Xenophontic Socrates shows, not with contemplating air or ether, but with understanding human life, especially in its moral, political, and erotic dimensions. In fact, he goes so far as to say that for the Platonic Socrates, the true knowledge of souls and hence of the soul is the core of cosmology. To understand that remark, one would need, I think, to follow Strauss's direction and turn to the friendly but far-reaching dispute between Socrates and Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium. And among other things, a consideration of that dispute would reveal I think, is that Socrates would not grant to Aristophanes that their differences, both practical and theoretical, are due to his disregard of eros, as opposed to his different and deeper understanding of it.
Now, as our practice, we have questioner Rory Schachter.
Thank you very much for the paper. It was very dense and complex. I just wanted to ask you just about one section, just one paragraph, which you read a part of, but if you don't mind, I'll just read it again. So it's on page 22. Near the top, fourth line down. And my questions will just be about this specific section. Let us start from the Socratic side of things.
Hang on just a second. I think I have a different version here than I sent
no.
you guys. So that's all right. I can find it quickly. Just
Sorry.
that's all right. All right. Good. I'll use yours.
Okay.
Yes.
Page 20. Let us start from the Socratic side of things. Why would the Socratic doctrine, which asserts the primacy of air or ether, lead to the demands for extreme continence and endurance? Perhaps the connection is this: to hold the first principle, the principle par excellence is air or ether, is to hold that nature in its most important aspects may be intelligible, but there is nothing truly shining, beautiful, or responsive about it. It would seem to follow from such a view that all we can reasonably ask of nature is to know it insofar as it is knowable, it is knowable, and that extreme continence and endurance are warranted and necessary to keep one's vision clear and to see nature as it really is. More than that, it would seem that in order to attain and preserve clarity about the primacy of air or ether, one must not only tether one's heart, but ruthlessly debunk all exalted claims about nature. And you quote Strauss, and then you end by, not end, but then you say, that is Socrates. So I just wanted to ask about this section. It seems to be about a sort of a portrait of asceticism. And now, asceticism may be a theoretical impossibility, so that even monks wearing horsehair coats love their habit, and so there's no such thing. Or asceticism could be like a mask, so the jockey wins the race, so it's really high-grade, high-class hedonism of a certain kind. But this portrait that you give, I mean, the first question is just, is this, when you say that is Socrates, do you mean that's Aristophanes' Socrates? Yeah. Or that, is it Strauss's view of Socrates? And it wasn't, and you, in your paper, you also present an idea that Strauss's Socrates is concerned with the knowledge of men's and women's souls as a microcosm.
Right.
But one could still ruthlessly debunk all exalted claims about the nature of men and women's souls. I mean, so it, in and of itself, this description doesn't, I'm not sure, and I didn't know how to take it, how close this description is, in your opinion, to what Strauss actually thought about Socrates. And just a couple sub-points, and I'll stop. What does it mean, these are your words, not Strauss's, but maybe you're paraphrasing, to say there's nothing truly shining. I mean, if something's, I mean, it's hard to see the stars in the city. You can go to the country, you can see them more clearly, but they're shining. And then if someone says, well, those suns are dead, it just takes a long time. And, well, okay, they're dead, but they're still shining. So how can you have something shining but not truly shining? And I guess the last point that I wanted to ask you about is, did Aristophanes, according to Strauss perhaps, somehow get it wrong? Like he was on the right path, and then he got some crucial things wrong? Or is he wasn't outfitted, his soul just wasn't Socratic or philosophic? I mean, for a second sailing, you need a ship that floats. So maybe he didn't have the ship, or he made a mistake. He was on the right path. I'll stop there. Thanks again for the paper.
All right. Sure. Thank you for your comments. Well, I guess I'll just take them in the order you asked them, and if I leave something out, just remind me. The that is Socrates, and for the formulation of 22, which I sort of tried to. What I tried to do there was
to imitate what I take to be the intentional overstatement of Aristophanes that I think Strauss imitates. So that is Socrates. I meant that is the Aristophanian Socrates. Okay. So certainly I meant that. I didn't mean that is Socrates as such. But as for whether Strauss thinks that this was true of the historical Socrates, I certainly think, first of all, insofar as the question is at all a yes to that yes has to be qualified with attention to comic exaggeration. So, I mean,
I don't think Socrates actually, slept or tried to think while he was being bitten by fleas, and he didn't practice a monkish kind of asceticism, surely not. So there's a kind of comic exaggeration. But Strauss points out at one point that the extreme continence that Aristophanes puts in this sort of absurd manner is a comic equivalent of a serious side of Socrates that can be seen even in signs of this even in Plato, when he points to, I think, some passages in the Alcibiades section of the Symposium where you can see Socrates' continence. And so I would say, and I think this would be maybe one moment of the general point I made at the beginning, where he thinks you can see some things about Socrates maybe more clearly in Aristophanes than you can in Plato and Xenophon. Because the poetic license and the stance as a critic of Socrates allows Aristophanes to say things that Plato and Xenophon wouldn't so openly say. So I would say, I think, with due weight given to the importance of comic exaggeration, which due weight is a lot of weight, I would say that Strauss is not think that Aristophanes is wildly on the wrong track here. As for the shining, shining there has to be taken metaphorically. I think it means I don't think it means, that there are no beings that give off light or things like that, obviously. So it means that it was essentially a kind of cold view of nature, where nature didn't respond to the human concern for beauty in any way. And so I think that's what he has in mind. And so I think one could hold that view while admitting that there's stars and things like that. So I think that as long as that term's read metaphorically, I think the point can stand. And then the last question was, did Aristophanes have something wrong in his soul that kept him from following the Socratic path?
His reasoning went off, or was it just he wasn't up to it?
Well, the reason I wouldn't put the question myself that way is it presupposes the superiority of the Socratic side of things, which is precisely what I think Strauss was trying, if I can use this horrible word that floats around these days, that's what Strauss is trying to problematize. And so it seems to me that to approach the book with this question, what was wrong with Aristophanes such that he differed from Socrates, is to presuppose that Socrates was right about everything. And I think part of the purpose of this book is to shake that view to some extent. And so to take maybe an example that I think maybe cuts to the core of it, if my argument is right, that Aristophanes thought Socrates had excessive confidence in his core theoretical assertion, that he was too confident in that, then the key question is really, in a way, a question more for Socrates than it is for Aristophanes. Is Aristophanes right about that? And I don't think one could prejudge whose flaws are in need of explaining until one had an answer to that question, if my general interpretation is right. Because if Aristophanes is right about that, then in a certain respect, you could say it's Socrates' flaws that are in need of explaining. And why was Socrates, what led him to be, to overstate the point, dogmatic, and also to close himself off from these experiences that he shouldn't have closed himself off from. And so I think the question you pose would be more a question for down the road, if one could show that the Platonic Socrates, the Xenophontic Platonic Socrates, was able to settle a matter more adequately than I think Aristophanes thought he was able to settle it. Then I think we would have more of a grounds for saying, well, what kept Aristophanes from seeing that or from being aware of that? And I suppose at that point the explanation could be both just thoughts that he didn't think or features of his character.
I thought the paper was wonderfully pleasing and it was very helpful to me. It reminded me of the Mars rover. It's you went to a distant planet and you found life. It's not microbial.
It's a good Aristophanian
life.
image.
And I especially admired your the way you brought out the life of a poet in an attractive way, both pointing out to possible limitations, but it's on the surface it seems to be so much more attractive than the life of Socrates, except for to young fanatics.
Like all of us in this room.
But I had a quibble with the way you frame Nietzsche's role in Strauss's discussion, and your comment is very tentative, but it's it seems to me that what was at issue is not whether Nietzsche's critique of Socrates was more adequate than Aristophanes, but rather just from the 3 pages that he talks about Nietzsche, what I got is that Strauss was impressed by Nietzsche's observation that Aristophanes' criticism could apply to Plato. So in other words, the question is this: if Plato adequately understood Aristophanes' critique and absorbed it, incorporated it into his political philosophy, the tradition is sound. And Nietzsche's suggestion is that Plato failed, and so that seems to be what is what is at the bottom of Strauss's investigation, that he wants to know precisely what that criticism is, and to see whether the Platonic approach is correct or the path of Nietzsche.
You mean, but by the Platonic approach there, you mean as an essentially rhetorical approach in the way philosophy is presented, or do you mean something else?
No, I meant something more.
Okay. What more did you?
Well, I mean that it's. I suppose, among other things, he must mean that whether the Platonic attempt to refute gods or demonstrate the non-existence of gods, succeeds or it's.
That seems to me plausible in and of itself, but it doesn't seem to me to fit that closely with what Strauss says about Nietzsche in the introduction, because he stresses, and maybe this is unfair, but this is the way he presents Nietzsche's critique in just as you said, just the 3 pages he talks about it. He presents it as essentially a political critique.
But I don't take that to be a denigration of the critique, rather as an indication of its comprehensiveness.
I think we'd have to look at the passage, but I do think he means it as a denigration, as opposed to Aristophanes, which I think he wants to suggest cuts deeper and cuts further than the political critique. I mean, because it's very clear in the book that Aristophanes is a political critique of Socrates, but I think it's also relatively clear that political critique of Socrates is not the most interesting, serious part of the book. And so I think in that sense he's already setting up that thought or that realization as the reader goes through the book. Yes, there's a political critique of Socrates. To some extent, Nietzsche's political critique of Socrates would be more or less the same as Aristophanes' political critique of Socrates. But with Aristophanes, we're going to find a whole lot more than that. So
But what about his emphasis on Nietzsche suggesting that Aristophanic criticism could be applied to
Plato?
Yeah.
Well, I think I think that's part of his I think it's part of his knocking down a impression that he allows at some point. I mean, there's one way of reading the critique of Socrates is to say, Aristophanes' critique of Socrates is to say, this is the pre-Socratic Socrates. This was the pre-turn Socrates. And so what we're going to learn from studying this is what was wrong with the early Socrates, the young Socrates, and how did he reorient himself in light of an awareness of that. And I think that's part of Strauss's effort to shoot that down, to say, no, this is not, you make a mistake if you think that what we see here is a critique of just the pre-Socratic Socrates, and then we can turn to Plato and Xenophon and say, oh, but look, he later changed and he became all of this. And to say, no, this is a critique of the Socrates himself. You can't take that easy way out. And I think he indicates that also by calling attention to the exchange in the symposium in a similar context, which when you think about the dates and so forth, I think it doesn't work out to claim that the clouds can be a critique of just the pre-turn Socrates. So that would be my explanation of that. I mean, now there may be more. You may be right. Perhaps there's more there. I have to go back and look. But that's the way I had taken it. Yes.
How would you, I'm just thinking more in terms of the symposium, how would you fit in this view from the symposium into what you said, and if it's not helpful, but the argument would be that Socrates, in contrast to Aristophanes, actually has a more pious view of love, that is, views Eros as being fundamentally theological, oriented towards love of God, whereas Aristophanes' view of Eros is in some way hostile to the gods and wants to, in a way that is not natural for human beings, wants to say that the focus of our love should be human beings.
Sorry, did I cut you off? I actually think that fits more than it first appears to fit, because I think that first appears to kind of contradict it, but in fact, I think in a way that may be an aspect of this disagreement. Because if Socrates thought that Eros was more thoroughly pious than Aristophanes did, and the reason I put it that way is because I do think, based on his speech in the symposium, that Aristophanes too thought there was an element of piety in it. So but if you say that if Socrates thought that Eros was the Socrates of the symposium now, not the Socrates of Aristophanes, thought that Eros was more thoroughly pious, I think that would be also one of the reasons why he held it at a greater remove, or was more thoroughly a critic of it, and kept it at a greater distance from himself than I think Aristophanes did. Whereas Aristophanes, I think, my interpretation of his is, I mean, he gives an incredibly difficult speech in the symposium, but I would just, as a kind of formula for trying to understand that speech, try to say that what he's trying to show about Eros in his speech in the symposium is that it's a complicated mixture of more natural ingredients and more conventional artificial ingredients. But that holds open the possibility of an Eros that is maybe not as full or as exalted if one takes away the conventional artificial elements, but it still has a kind of a greater natural core than Socrates might have thought, and therefore more worthy of embrace by a man like him. And so I think Aristophanes' speech in the symposium culminates in the recommendation of a semi-erotic life. I mean, he says we can't have the best, we can't have this grand union we want. So what should we do instead? Well, we should find a like-minded beloved and have which is a sort of it's a come down from what was promised, but it's still a semi-erotic thing. I think in Socrates' speech, I mean that too, I mean is extremely complicated, but the exalted image of ultimately at the peak, it's no longer erotic. Strauss makes this point in his book on the Symposium, I think, that at the very peak of the ladder of love, it's no longer described as loving, or the term eros drops out and it's just beholding, which means that in some sense eros is more fully transcended or left behind in the Socratic picture than it is in the Aristophanian picture. And I think that could be put together with this thought, that if Socrates thought that eros was more thoroughly pious, whereas Aristophanes said, no, but it also has this important natural core, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah, Daniel, and then
Related to Mary's question, and how you work the symposium with you. In that speech, the emphasis seems to be on the horizontality of eros, that there's nothing vertical, it doesn't take you out.
Could you speak louder, please?
It's all horizontal, eros, towards other human beings, on the political plane or the erotic plane. Nothing vertical leading out
Right.
or beyond. So that kind of, I always took it to be a kind of critique that maybe Aristophanes, the accusation is, can't ground mind in nature. That's somehow part of the problem.
that he can't.
Ground-mindedness, that we can know things, what you said before, and yet he takes pleasure in knowing things. So in a way that the problem is sort of like that of Lucretius, that there's no relation between wisdom and the objects of wisdom. It's not subordinate, and therefore it's just one more pleasurable thing among the other pleasurable things, like singing, sex, and food, but of no special or higher status. If that's right, the question would become, is that fundamental difference then between mature Socrates and Aristophanes based on different reasonings, what Rory said, that he didn't understand something? Or, as you said, he had good reasons to understand it this way, and that the difference then turns on differences in experiences, different soul types. They really experienced the world somewhat differently.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, I mean, just as a kind of guess more than anything else, I suspect that it's really a combination of the two, that it was a difference of soul type or character combined with different thoughts. And so, but I would say the first task, I think the better way to approach it is not to speculate about soul types, but to try to find out what the different thoughts are and to set them against each other. And so, I mean, would be a whole nother step way beyond what I've tried to do here, which I don't think Strauss really tries to do in Socrates and Aristophanes, which is to turn to the Symposium and to try to set the Socratic and try to pull out the Socratic arguments there and set them against the Aristophanean arguments there. So, and you know, I don't think anything, you can't really speak about that without just making just completely ungrounded assertions.
Well, I think you can. I'll give you an example. In that speech in the Symposium, the suggestion is that there's nothing vertical about eros. And yet in treatment of the plays by Strauss, he shows us often that it is vertical as well. So that seems to be one place where the treatment in the Symposium doesn't.
Well, then that would seem to just mean that Plato, if that's true, then that would just seem to mean that Plato was then unfair to Aristophanes, that Aristophanes understood it more. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, I know Strauss talks at length that uses this term horizontal and vertical in his interpretation of the Symposium, but frankly, I find that too formulaic. I don't find it helpful to think about whether eros is horizontal or vertical. I mean, I suppose, let's say what we mean by that. The eros for Aristophanes meant primarily love of another person.
Yes.
All right, fine. And start from that. And then it also meant primarily that for Socrates too. But then he seemed to think that experience would, if really taken seriously and looked into, lead one beyond just another person. So all right, I think you can begin to flesh it out that way. But and so what did you mean though in saying that in this book, Aristophanes presents it as vertical?
Well, just that he shows things beyond loving other individual beings with the city. He cares about foundings, about gods, about nature, astronomy. So he both shows an awareness of this other kind of erotic longing. He himself engages in it, to the extent to which he shows us he understands these phenomena. I mean, this is in a way the most philosophic book ever, insofar as it describes all these phenomena with such concrete detail.
But being philosophic about lofty phenomena is not the same thing as loving things beyond loving these things. I mean, eros means loving, not just trying to grasp them.
Can I come in?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a question out of my obsession with thumos, and my experience as a youth in Columbus, Ohio, home of Ohio State University. Yeah.
I thought you grew up in
Enemy of Kenyon and Gambier.
You know, we won the first football game against Ohio State. We still have the football with the score emblazoned on it.
Really? Yeah. Well, hold on to that. You know, it's a large place with almost an infinite number of students, hard to count, 40 or 50,000 maybe.
Oh yeah,
or
Texas
something like
Texas
that.
is bigger.
Texas is bigger. Well, anyway, when I was there was a joke that went around, how many students are there at Ohio State? Answer, 1 in 100. So in other words, when you're serious about your definition of a student, you can regard these people who call themselves students or who are counted as students by the administration and tuition collected from them as boastful, comical equivalents of what a real student is, as if there could be 40 or 50,000 people with the kind of qualifications that get you admitted to Ohio State who are real students. So, and this reminds one of a little bit of Socrates and Plato's Socrates. And you could think of a dialogue which would begin with Socrates and an Ohio State student. He said, "I'm a student from Ohio State," and so Socrates asks him what a student is, and that leads him into trouble. Yeah. So there is this kind of this is something like what an idea is too, right? There's this kind of some kind of invisible notion of a student, which is above the visible or countable ones, and which we never really entirely suppress, even though we find it necessary and useful to count the so-called students. But still we need this sort of critical definition of it, as if there were a kind of visible realm of intelligibility above all the visible things that we bump into and see, and that make sense of this invisible realm makes sense of the visible. Because an Ohio State student still has some kind of claim on, tenuous claim on what it really means to
What's your ratio here?
Yes, yeah, what's our ratio to Harvard, he asked. Yeah. Well, I don't know, but we got a certain number. Yeah. Anyway, so you could say that if Aristophanes is, since thumos is sort of necessary to comedy, thumos is our sense of self-importance, which is boasting, and which needs to be cut down to size by those who have a better understanding than the boaster, and assuming that this is possible to do. So you could say that the 40 or 50,000 students, that's a sort of boastful or comic equivalent of the real student. Or maybe Strauss wants to say that Socrates or Plato has in mind, or Aristophanes has in mind, a criticism of this, saying that it's boastful to think that it's possible to get a full definition of the intelligible things which are beyond the visible things, and that a Socratic philosopher is a kind of boaster insofar as he claims to know things, as he does in the Republic. But then, turning the tables and showing that thumos has something to contribute to philosophy, instead of being just the basis of boastful equivalence of, or comic equivalence of philosophy. Think of the passage in the Republic regarding Leontius, who covers his eyes, to keep himself from seeing something that he knows is shameful to be interested in, namely a bunch of corpses lying on the ground. Doesn't that suggest that there's some necessity for the philosopher in being able to correct his, and to hold down his lower desires, hence the continence and staying away from wine and sex that is attributed to Socrates. Maybe it is possible for a philosopher to live a little, to have a little bit of wine and a little bit of sex, but a little, there's a limit to it. And to get that limit, you need thumos, you need the capacity to reject and to deny yourself something. And what is eros, so what is left out of eros by Aristophanes, you could say, is what is contributed by thumos, namely cooperation with eros, or in refinement of it, or namely that eros has degrees. So if not vertical and horizontal, higher and lower. And that there's a reason why you would develop continence as to wine and sex, in order to get the love of higher things, or the highest thing. And after all, maybe the best student would have to be something like a god.
Well, it seems that to judge by the Aristophanian portrait of Socrates, you could say he exercised his by calling it continence and not moderation. There's the suggestion that he does hold down, that it's not, that there's something that's held down, and therefore that thumos might play a role in that holding down. But I don't think it's the case with his presentation of Socrates that you could say that his Socrates uses thumos to hold down his desires so as to activate a higher eros. There's some passages in Plato that suggest that kind of thing. But I think the Aristophanian portrait of Socrates is, no, he was, that Socrates should be, it's better to understand Socrates as altogether unerotic. And not therefore his philosophy, his philosophizing about the things aloft should not be understood as high eros or something like that. That would be a grave mistake in the way one understands Socrates, to think of it that way. And that too may be a point on which Strauss might think we see something in Aristophanes helps correct a misimpression that we can get from Plato, where you can get this impression that philosophy is just eros perfected. And I do think there's things in Plato himself that cast doubt on that, but Aristophanes, I think, more helpfully punctures that image than Plato punctures that image.
Well, you answered the second part of my statement.
Oh, what was the
not
student?
The first.
What was the first?
Which was that there's a kind of necessity toward, in the ordinary understanding of things, toward the higher understanding of things. And then, so That, and I didn't mean to say that.
Oh, you
that-
mean
Yeah.
towards something like the doctrine of the ideas?
Yeah. And that this is what lies behind our speech, our communication skills.
Yeah,
and-
I do think.
and that-
I mean, I think Plato,
and
Plato,
so-
Socrates
so-
thought
so
that.
everything is not at one level then.
Well,
It's
the
not-
question, the
there is
the
an-
key
there is
question
an
on whether
eros.
this.
There is an eros. You're trying to get something better than what you have.
I think that question hinges on the status of the ideas for Plato, whether those should be understood as existing in a somehow a higher realm than the particulars or not, or what exactly is, if I can use a pretentious word, what's the ontological status of the ideas? Do they exist on a higher plane, or are they conceptions, universals that the mind forms of the particulars on in the world, but they don't have they may be more helpful for understanding, but they don't in and of themselves have a higher dignity. I've been teaching the books 5 and 6 of the Republic recently, and that seems to be the key question there, in which way the ideas should be understood as existing in this on this higher ontological level, or as universals in a more mundane sense. And I mean, I lean towards the second view, but I couldn't even begin to really defend that adequately here. It doesn't seem to be an aspect of Socratic philosophy that Aristophanes considered or dealt with. So it seems that kind of question seems to me pretty much absent from
Well, think of the two definitions of student. One is mundane, that's the 40, 50,000, and the other isn't. The other is when you're serious about understanding a student. What is student properly understood? Isn't that higher? Isn't that?
But even if it's higher in a way, I'm not sure that means that we need a kind of erotic assent to grasp it. I'm not sure that it means anything more than we need to be rigorous and purify what exactly we mean by it in ordinary
The ordinary
speech.
student, if you insulted him by saying that he's not a real student, he would defend himself. So he would be looking for some higher thing to explain to you, that what you call goofing off, and watching TV, and going to the football games and so on, all that has an important educational function.
I teach at University of Texas, so I would concede the point. It doesn't.
I thought, so from the way you were framing the difference between, you or Strauss, between Aristophanes and Socrates, I thought it followed that Aristophanes' view of Socrates had to be, in a couple ways, at least a couple ways, more complex than you were saying. And, I mean, it wasn't your intention to go into this, maybe too, but I thought two came immediately to mind. So the first is that if Aristophanes' view is that the origins are dark, and in response to this, one has some kind of latitude to fill the gap with your full humanity, however he understands that. How does he then understand Socrates' course? I mean, does he think that Socrates thinks that the origins aren't as dark? Does he really think that that Socrates?
Can I answer that question
Sure,
before I
yeah,
answer the
yeah.
second? That's an excellent question. It's very hard to know on the basis of Aristophanes' presentation. And to this extent, there might be some truth to the thought that Aristophanes didn't appreciate or understand fully the Socratic turn. There might be an element of truth in that, even if the more simple view that he's just critiquing the pre-Socratic Socrates is untenable. Mm-hmm. It might be that there was a side of Socrates' theoretical thought that he potentially didn't grasp, namely the extent, just to sort of simplify it in formula, the extent to which Socrates might agree with him that the origins are dark. I guess it seems to be the case, and I'm perfectly open to this impression being corrected, but it seems to be the case that he thought Socrates was more optimistic about the intelligibility of nature and of some kind of origin than he thought Socrates had a right to be.
But so that would be a theoretical difference.
It
That
seems to
Aristophanes
be.
would be like, I got these arguments,
Well,
and you
well, it
don't
wouldn't exactly be, or he would see Socrates' position and think you don't have a right to that. You don't have a right to claim to know, to as full a theoretical insight as you think you have. Something like that. But I find that question frustratingly difficult to answer on the basis of the clouds. So that seems to me, what I just said seems to me to be a plausible speculation, but I just have not found any way of getting beyond making it anything other than a plausible speculation.
Okay.
But sorry, did you want to?
Well, yeah.
Ask
So
second.
it's. I mean, the going along with that. So how he understood Socrates' theoretical view. That was the initial part, and then the second part is, he must have been also in a way bewildered by Socrates' uneroticism. I mean, if he and Socrates are intellectually quite close, what is Aristophanes looking at Socrates going to make of this guy who's apparently living a terrible life for very unclear reasons? I mean, does Aristophanes think there's something wrong with him that he's
No, I
aiming
think
at?
he must have seen to some extent Socrates' critique of these, understood Socrates'
Okay.
critique of those experiences, and there would be two elements that I think he would both have seen. One, that Socrates was a critic of such experiences, and he would have known that to some extent. And I think we can get some of that even from the things that he teaches Pheidippides to some extent. But also, and so there would be that he saw that Socrates was a critic of ordinary erotic experience. And then he seems to also thought, and he seems to have seen that Socrates thought that such experiences were also problematic to clarity, and that Socrates was holding himself back from such experiences out of a concern for that. Whether that holding back is simply just a kind of consequence of the critique, or whether it also required a somewhat a semi-thumatic self-restriction, I think that it could be either of those or a combination of
Okay.
those.
And then, so then the last part was the last element is, did Aristophanes, you said that a lot depends for Socrates on his confidence about the question of the gods, but doesn't, and Aristophanes can sit with some darkness on this matter, but can he really, just in the sense of, doesn't his life involve, perhaps not in the same way, a deviation from conventional belief,
Yeah, it's.
but
Sorry.
yeah, so wouldn't his life also be
It
an
would be a
error?
problem, but it wouldn't be a problem on quite the same extent or in all the same ways, because
Okay.
that he. I mean, I suppose you could say it's a problem. He ran the risk of punishment, but he doesn't seem. I think he would have regarded that as. He would have regarded punitive gods as not something that he could have totally excluded, but not as something that was at all a likely possibility. And I think the bigger difference is that the gods would be a problem for Socrates, not so much as possibly punishing him for living his life, but insofar as their existence would make knowledge so problematic. It's more as a threat to knowledge. And so the points I was trying to put together was, well, if theory or the concern for knowledge didn't hold quite the same place for Aristophanes as it did for Socrates. And I don't want to go too far with that, because obviously it held some place. But if it didn't hold quite the same place, then this problem wouldn't cut as deeply for him as it would for Socrates.
Related to your suggestion that according to Strauss, that Aristophanes had love for and appreciation of the golden, or the resplendent, the beautiful. How would you make sense of the strange fact, that in the symposium, in Plato's symposium, the beautiful is entirely missing from the speech of Aristophanes, that love for Aristophanes is not of the beautiful, but of one's own other half, simply because it's yours, not because it's beautiful in any way, and moreover, it's love of your own, for the end, it seems, ultimately, of self-assertion, of individual self-assertion, being oneself as a whole, as distinct from anybody else, or the gods, or the cosmos.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
for
I wouldn't call that self-assertion, but let me not dwell on that, because I think the core of your question is a really good question and a problem. I don't think it's entirely true that the beautiful is completely absent from Aristophanes' account of love. I mean, the role that Apollo plays in doing some of the recrafting work after Zeus is cut seems to point to a stage in which human beings become more beautiful. So it may be, but even if that's right, and that's contestable, I know. But even if that's right, I think you're still right. It's certainly not emphasized. And so I think you're right. There is a difficulty. There is a problem there. I mean, I'm inclined to think that his lack of emphasis on the beautiful was to some extent part of his effort to preserve a natural core of Eros, because he had some inkling that Socrates had a set of critical reflections on the beautiful that he couldn't completely stave off, but he wanted to say that Eros is not just about this. Now, all right, but how would that then bear on how one takes this passage on the theocosmogony on 173, where he talks about the naturally festive and golden? It strikes me there as important that he doesn't quite say the naturally beautiful and noble. And so it seems to me that what he's saying, what Aristophanes, if I'm right, is presented there as embracing, is not fully the concern for the beautiful understood as the kalon, or the beautiful that also means the noble. And in fact, that Strauss goes out of his way here to say that don't think that Aristophanes was any less a critic of nomos, of law, than Socrates was in the same passage. I think it fits with that. So it's not, I think what he's saying here is it's not quite right to say Aristophanes was more concerned with the kalon. But yet there was something that he thought Socrates was not giving its due weight. And he sticks this, in a way, very evocative, but also very enigmatic phrase on it, the naturally festive and golden. A phrase which I find in a way very helpful because it is so evocative. But on the other hand, it's frustrating because it's so, what the hell exactly is the naturally festive and golden? I don't know, but it sounds good, it sounds like something I would like to and so it's, but it does seem to me important that I don't think it is naturally festive and golden equals kalon. I think no. In other words, if you say one could interpret that phrase as a kind of exalted, poetic, beautiful way of saying the kalon, the noble. I don't know whether you know Greek, but the noble, the term that means the term that means the noble or beautiful. That term is just a kind of poetic way of saying that. But I don't think that's quite right, and I don't think the passage as a whole would support that. And so it's and yet on the other hand, he seems to say, look, it's a mention that Socrates didn't appreciate, that this kind of cold, simply debunked view of nature, which he says is radically amusic, as he puts it also in this section, radically unerotic amusic. Socrates didn't appreciate this, and the fact that the way he speaks of it is what makes me think that Aristophanes really still was trying to preserve this by, he says that the birds, now you could say, well, it's the birds, but still, assign an unassailable place to the naturally festive and golden. That seems to me, what he means by that is, this Aristophanes did not think was merely conventional. This was not, the essence of this was not convention. It was, if it was, then it would be assailable, and it wouldn't be the naturally festive and golden. So this phrase is at once I find a very helpful, illuminating phrase, and yet it still leaves one wishing for so much more clarification because this phrase is so odd.
Yeah, although if we look at Socrates' speech in the Symposium, it would seem to be that he proposes that the aim of Eros is some vision of the cosmos that is this naturally festive and beautiful. A vast sea of beauty is the way that it's described there. So it would seem from the Symposium that actually Socrates would be the person, not Aristophanes, who sees the cosmos as naturally.
Yeah, this would be a massive, massive difference between the Aristophanian Socrates and the Platonic Socrates. And I suspect Strauss's view is that on this, the Aristophanian Socrates is somewhat closer to what Socrates really thought.
So Plato's is what Plato thought. but
That
falls into-
Plato, you could say Plato, as he, to put it in Strauss's phrase, the Platonic Socrates owes his being as much to poetry as this Aristophanian Socrates does. Just to a Platonic poetry, not an Aristophanian poetry. Yes. Oh, yes.
So, which thinker do you think stands closest to Aristophanes in spiritual kinship after the Greek age? Are there any writers who sort of inherited this vision of thinking?
Does this sound like Machiavelli? That was the name that kind of popped into my head.
Jonathan Swift.
You mean in the comedy or in the core thought?
Is this a comedy? Yes.
Oh, in the comedy. Oh, geez, I don't know. I mean, this seems to me, in some respects, a kind of unique position. I can't think of another person who's sort of an Aristophanian. At least nobody comes into my mind as somebody who quite fits this position.
Boccaccio, some of the funny people.
Oh, surely there was comedy later, but this particular kind of comedy woven together with the particular outlook that I've tried to uncover, I can't think of quite an example that would be the same as that.
I mean, and also, in what kind of, do you think, environment do you need for this kind of comedy to thrive? Do you need a specific kind of environment?
Well, it does seem that I don't know that you need one, but it does seem that Aristophanes and the Greek polis were a marriage made in heaven, as vexed a marriage as it was, troubled a marriage as it was. They were perfect. He was good for the city, and the city was good for him. I mean, that it really was a match made in heaven, that he would come along, and probably not just by chance. I mean, I'm sure that he was who he was partly for having grown up in that setting, especially of the life of the vigorous political and erotic life in the polis, together with the presence of philosophy, seems to have been just a kind of perfect combination for producing a figure like Aristophanes. So that may be one reason, by the way, that it's hard to think of another Aristophanes, because the conditions had to be so fortuitous to give rise to something like that. Yes, Catherine.
I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the character of the pleasures that Aristophanes saw as natural and possible. I mean, especially this sort of natural form of eros, and then just generally this point that you emphasized or brought out from Strauss
Yeah.
than Socrates, and that, in a way, comic poetry as such, writing comic poetry as such, is a sort of social pleasure.
Right.
Obviously, sex and then wine. I mean, the thing that I'm wondering is it's hard for me to see how those could be. I mean, how do you, with eros, for example, to have a natural form of eros, what do you get beyond beyond sex? It seems like the intense pleasure involved in it, insofar as there is some other intense pleasure besides the physical, merely physical animal level, has something to do with the pleasure of being loved. And without, I mean, could eros be very pleasant without a pleasure of being loved? And could there be a pleasure of being loved which was not a kind of confusion?
Well, it might be something like a kind of natural sociality of human beings, especially when it comes to kindred souls, that we delight and take pleasure in being together with other human beings and doing things like drinking, having sex, and enjoying comedies together. And that the togetherness adds an essential element to the experience that isn't artificial, but is a kind of reflection of a natural human sociality. I'll tell you where I was getting all of this. I was getting it, well, really from two places, but mainly from one, and then I'll say the second later. From the account of the Acarnians. And what Strauss does is he builds up to this question of what Dikaiopolis' end is. What's this guy really seeking? And he heightens the importance of that question as interpretation unfolds, because he makes a point of saying this is a stand-in for Aristophanes. So pay attention. This is going to be an account of Aristophanes' end too. And then he says the first answer is that he likes to he prepares a dinner just for himself, present feasting, and then he says, but no, that's not it. And then he says there's a movement from the pleasure of food to the pleasure of drink and sex. And Strauss makes a big deal out of this movement. And it's there, once he says drink and sex, he says, that's when he brings Aristophanes back. And he says, this is more, it's here. And then he says, and then I'll just read the passage. He says, more precisely, in contrast to the Acarnians who depend on the city but are no longer useful to the city, Dikaiopolis, who can take care of himself and takes care only of himself, is by the manner in which he takes care only of himself, i.e. by enjoying himself to the highest degree, doing what his nature compels him to do. He is the greatest benefactor of the city. For who can doubt that the comic poet enjoyed himself to the highest degree in conceiving and elaborating his comedies? Yet this enjoyment necessarily communicates itself. Comedy, whose mother is laughter, gives birth to laughter. The comic poet's enjoyment is essentially social, although it is not simply political. It is akin in different ways to the enjoyment deriving from wine and from sex, rather than that from deriving from food, however delicious. So, what I mean by that, I think what he means, now, somebody raised the objection to my paper, can't you enjoy wine and sex by yourself? And without getting too Aristophanian about the possibilities, I concede that point. But I think what he has in mind is drinking wine. I'll leave sex aside since I'm much more squeamish than Aristophanes. Drinking wine together with friends is a kind of, the joy we take in that is a tapping into a kind of natural sociality and semi-eros. I mean, I don't want to go too far in calling it erotic, but insofar as it's a joy that we naturally take in a shared pleasure. The essence, so that the pleasure couldn't quite be the same if it weren't shared. And I think what Aristophanes is saying to Socrates is, look, there's something natural in that. And that's not a mistake, or we're not deluding ourselves or something like that. There's something natural in that, and therefore something to be embraced about that. There's another passage where he later, this is at the end of the Plutos, if I can find it, where he speaks of, he says, men's enjoyment of life derives less from their awareness of their justice than from eros, music, and the like. And I think he wanted to say these kinds of pleasures, not only are they natural, but in a way they're the core of what makes life attractive.
Natural in the sense of something we enjoy without compulsion, I could see, but then.
And without delusion, without compulsion and
Right,
without
but
delusion.
Without delusion is the trickier part. I mean, why do you need wine in the first place? Why doesn't wine help you to forget things?
Yeah.
And I mean, Aristotle says that when people are drinking wine, they become full of hope. And I mean,
Yeah.
isn't it a kind of deliberate attempt to?
It is, but it also seems to, wine also seems to be a kind of facilitator of our natural sociality. It kind of lets it come out. It lets the barriers between people break down, and therefore lets a kind of natural sociality come out. And that Aristophanes didn't view it as simply, wine as something that simply obscures the vision. Seems to be pointed to by one of these sort of typical Straussian lines, or Strauss lines. Actual Strauss here. When he's talking about he says at one point, he speaks in the Nights of Demosthenes' decision to drink wine and thus bring his thought or life to its highest pitch. So that there's something in that that's not just a clouding of our vision, but allowing us to become, in a way, fully who we are. And it seems to me important that he also includes thought there, too. That I think he would say, we don't really understand human life if we also don't, allow ourselves to live it more than Socrates did. It's going to be difficult for it to understand it if we hold it at such a remove.
It's hard for me to see how the pleasures can be very intense without some delusions there. I mean, making people laugh without feeling that it's some reflection of one's own success and skill, and that one is there for good, or that one is liked with people. I mean, it's hard, and the fact that the pleasure would be so much more intense with those delusions makes me wonder, well, why would he draw the line at not having delusions if it would lead to much more intense pleasure?
Well, because I think he might just say, if one thinks they're delusions, it's just then not possible to fully give yourself to them. And when you were saying it reminded me of the other passage I had in mind. The other passage I had in mind was on this question of in what way these should be understood as erotic and in what way not. In the symposium speech, this point that I already made, that his speech culminates in the suggestion, the most intense, full-blown eros, the really exalted type, can't achieve what it wants. But then he says, so what do we do? It's basically the reasoning of speech. What do we do, given that we can't have that? And then the answer is something I think you're right, would be somewhat less intense, unless it wouldn't involve the flight of the soul in quite the same way. But I think he would say, but there is still a natural core there, and the seeing the problems of the more exalted vision doesn't wither the whole thing in its entirety.
Sorry, I just, on this one point about eros, this is where it's hardest for me to see, because, so do you think he would say that the pleasure that you take in feeling that you love, this kind of giving love, not just I need you, but I love, and the pleasure you take in being loved, that there can be that can be natural, that's.
I don't think he's going. I think it's a little more. It's a little less exalted than that. The vision
But
that
it's not
he has
just
in mind.
exalted. I mean, without that, it seems like you basically have a physical pleasure plus companionship, which seems pretty cold. Frat parties.
No. I think he would say no. You don't. He would say no. You're missing what we all delight in, which is not so. It's not so low and contemptible. The joy that like-minded souls take in being together and doing things they enjoy together. That's not just physical pleasure combined with just sort of the raw companionship or something like that. I mean, I think this could take higher forms. I think he would have higher forms of it in mind. Example, the symposium. what they're doing there would be a classic, I think would be an example of exactly what he has in mind. And he would say, Socrates, isn't there a great joy here? And not just because we're trying to understand Eros better, but just, isn't there a great joy in this? Is this part of what makes life something worth living? And it's not like they were all just indulging in physical pleasures and companionship. I mean, they were drinking moderately.
But they weren't having sex.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily. Sex, in some sense, I think becomes a kind of is almost more of a metaphor for what he has in mind, because he says here, he talks here about the comic poet's pleasure.
I'm sorry, who's the he? Strauss?
Strauss is talking about the kind of pleasure that Aristophanes had in mind. It wasn't primarily sex, it seems. It was more companionship, and the kind of companionship that went together with writing the comedies. The shared. He seems to present that writing the comedies as a kind of shared experience. And so I don't think it's just sex that he has in mind. But it includes that. I mean, I don't think he's saying, well, that the kind of, if this is all right, the kind of relationships he would envision would be chaste or something like that.
So like life in the Gorgias tavern.
Is that where Falstaff and how? Yeah, sounds pretty.
So that, in answer to his question, Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's maybe Shakespeare is the closest. Yes.
I think this discussion of Aristophanes' view of companionship and eros may have drifted a little bit away from our earlier, I'm sure it's drifted away from a lot of things, drifted away from theology a little bit more than it should have. And I was thinking over the course of this discussion, I mean, to me, and I assume to a lot of other people too, the difficult phrase here is this naturally festive, this phrase, the naturally festive and golden. And on my first reading of your paper, it seemed to me that the naturally festive and golden referred to wine and sex, and we could refine that toward general companionship, as you did in your discussion with Catherine. But it's striking to me, though, that phrase comes up in Strauss's discussion of the birds for the following reason. I think that phrase, the naturally festive and golden, is actually a reference to what the birds say. They refer to Eros as having golden wings, and then they say to the human beings, if you worship us, we will provide you with all sorts of good things, including feasts. So I wonder, particularly since, the type of feasting that Aristophanes must have had in mind in his own society was chiefly concerned with feasts of the gods. I wonder if Aristophanes thinks that there can't really be any true companionship or enjoyment outside of, feasting on theological occasions.
That, I think, would make Aristophanes a much, much more robust defender of conventional piety than Strauss's interpretation allows. I mean, there's all sorts of...
Just its necessity, right? I mean, is there anything naturally festive or golden in the birds other than the feasts that human beings get in exchange for worshiping?
Yeah, but that's complicated. It's also precisely what's turning them away from the Olympian gods, from the old gods. Right? It's part of the birds' attempt to pull human beings away from the gods, and it ends up in a situation where the birds are really just kind of foot soldiers of Tyros, which ends up in a human. So it doesn't seem that example really would convert into Aristophanes saying it's in a conventional feast in honor of the gods that we really find this naturally festive and golden. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of this, but I think it's an allusion in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. I did some Googling. Bless the cup that wants to overflow, that the water may flow from it golden. That's That's section 1, and then section 16. The friend should be the festival of the earth to you in anticipation of the overman. I guess it's in the bird speech, but it seems Nietzschean allusion to. I don't know what to make of that.
I think Strauss just, took some phrases from the bird speech and then turned them into this kind of evocative formulation of his own. It's not, as far as I know, it's not a direct quote, and so I think he just sort of pulled this language out of the bird speech and created this phrase. By the way, just as a sort of way of getting one's mind around what he could mean by it, it might help to think about examples like the one that just came up, the symposium. That would seem to me to be an example of what concretely the naturally festive and golden might look like in action. Yes,
Devin,
Susan?
you have to, sorry, I don't know. Oh, Susan, okay.
Quick point of information.
Okay, there are just 3 questions
Yeah, this
behind
is
where
not
you
more-
can
Do
see.
you happen to know what the Greek word used in the root for festive is?
No, I don't.
Oh, I have a question. One of my favorite line from your paper was when you described Strauss as an author who seems to refuse to descend to the level of heavy-handed clarity. and I wondered if you're right that there are a lot of big ifs in your paper, and I wonder if your answers to those ifs in going through this exercise has given you an appreciation for why Strauss wrote this book and the way he wrote it. I mean,
Sure.
part of understanding, you want to understand this book, and
Right.
part of understanding the book is the manner in which he wrote the book, which is
Right.
very odd to us.
It is very strange, and it's because it doesn't write like an unfolding of a clear, developed argument where you're really trying to help your readers see. But it's by turns it's obscure. Sometimes it seems like merely summary. Then there are these very arresting passages that seem to lead one clearly to one conclusion, but then there's other passages that seem to be in tension with them. He's very open about the atheism of the Aristophanian Socrates. He is very hard to pin down on Aristophanes' own view of the gods. And so I think he wanted it to be a kind of baffling mystery in which one had to dig and probably do some of the final stages of thinking on one's own. It's not a book that I think allows you to say, "Their passage settles it. I got it." That's what Strauss thinks. Aristophanes thinks, and so, and I assume that his reasons for writing it were a combination of wanting to make difficult to find some thoughts that he thought were very explosive, together with just urging the reader to do a lot of the work himself or herself.
There's Martha and there's Tom, both in your blind spots.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay,
I thought
Tom?
you wanted to ask a question.
I just wanted to ask you about another difference between Socrates and Aristophanes. Aristophanes wrote Plato, so there's a public character to his.
Oh yeah, and this is a major theme of the whole book, that Aristophanes is. This can be explained 80% on the level of the practical prudential critique, because what he argues is that by being a playwright, Aristophanes was able to give himself a kind of status, protection, and power within the city that didn't leave him vulnerable and exposed, as the burning down of Socrates' think tank shows, is an indication that Socrates has left himself. And so there's a major theme of the work is comedy as comedy writing as a kind of political action, both for the sake of the city and for the sake of, more importantly, and turns out in the book, for the sake of self-protection. So that's the main way in which that difference is treated. But then there's this other way in which it's treated too, that he seems to suggest that the writing of comedies was part of Aristophanes' somewhat different life he led. That it wasn't just, you could say, it wasn't just the means by which he thought he could present a philosophic position, but it reflected a difference with Socrates regarding the end, and the fact that he weaves comedy writing in to that passage on the Carnians where he's talking about the shared pleasures of wine and sex, and those become the those are the kind of comic equivalents of comedy writing. I think indicates that comedy writing also he also treats it as a reflection of this deeper difference between Socrates and Aristophanes, not just the political rhetorical difference. Yes, Bob.
The Platonic Socrates in the Hippias and many other places shows a real attraction to beauty, and also says at one point, at least his alter ego says in the first Hippias, that whenever he sees or judges something beautiful, it's arresting. He sort of a beginning of consideration. I'm not stating precisely what's there, but that's roughly what's there. Can you, I'm taking you away from Socrates and Aristophanes, but can you say something about that? The significance of that, of the beauty, if not the beautiful, if not the noble, for a kind of starting point of Socrates' alter ego, the more theoretical.
Yeah, and this would seem to be a side of Socrates that Aristophanes, I wouldn't say, it's probably better to say abstracts from rather than didn't see, but the seriousness with which he took the human experience of the beautiful, and in the few passages where Strauss says anything about a response that Socrates might give to Aristophanes, it's somewhat along these lines, that he in fact did take the human experience of beauty and of eros quite seriously, and that was a crucial part of his thought. But now, what he thought about it is, of course, a massive question, and I would say his thought begins from a recognition of its power and its arresting power, and he does justice to that, at least the Platonic Socrates does. But it also doesn't end there, and in the Hippias Major itself, there's it may begin with that thought, but then there's a very painstaking analysis of the beautiful, which is, at least in some respects, a critical analysis too. That's Linda.
Yeah, just back to Aristophanes and Socrates for a minute. Why, even if Aristophanes exaggerates to some extent this extreme continence, why, if the pleasures that he describes don't threaten to lead to a kind of confusion or obscuring, why would, according to Aristophanes, it take that continence on the part of Socrates to avoid them? I mean, why not think that, these are just not pleasures that Socrates enjoys? I mean, despite sort of the obvious, fact that he did enjoy at least.
I think Aristophanes probably thought that the disagreement was that Socrates thought that they were more obscuring than he did. Okay. And so I think he thought that that the difference would have to be understood that way, that he knew that Socrates was not just a cold fish, but that Socrates had a criticism of some of these pleasures as obscuring, and therefore that was part of it, and that the disagreement was partly over that. Well, and in that sense, you could say, a kind of formula for it might be of just how much of nature there was in it and how much of convention there was in it.
And insofar as, I can interrupt, sorry. Insofar as there was something natural, there would be a requirement to the tethering of the heart. Isn't that a problem? I mean, it came up a little bit earlier. It's a very
well, the
striking
tethering of the
formulation.
heart is my phrase, and and maybe that's not. I mean, that's my phrase for what Strauss calls extreme continence.
Yeah.
But I suppose you could say that's implied by extreme continence too, right? I mean, that it's not called moderation, but it's called continence, I assume.
If you follow Aristotle's distinction between the one need.
Or yeah, but I mean, you mean that moderation, that incontinence, the pleasures persist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore there's a kind of struggle.
Right.
And hence a tether required.
Well,
And I'm
I mean,
wondering
with the
about that.
extreme continence would seem to be Aristophanes' description funneled through Strauss of Socrates. So it would be an expression of Aristophanes' view of the matter, in which he would say, if the fact that pleasures were natural, even if Socrates didn't deny that, he wouldn't it be consistent with his view that Socrates would still be fighting against them?
Yeah, so that would be an aspect of the criticism.
I think so.
The existence of the tether, so to speak.
You mean he would take that as a point in his
Sign.
favor? Yeah.
Yeah.
If you need to tether, then that's
Yeah.
nature telling you something. Yeah.
I took the phrase "tether one's heart" as coming from Kaufman's translation of Beyond Good and
That's
Evil.
exactly where I got it.
Not exactly.
I have this. I with my son in the morning, every morning, I say, "Tethered heart," and he says, "Free spirit." and we pump fits. That's my little naturally festive and golden. He doesn't know what it means yet, though. It's only 3.5.
Well, this sounds like a stopping point, and we'd like to thank our speaker and congratulate him on his wonderful understanding and presentation of things.